Hello again, Michelle. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. How were your holidays?
Oh, they were nice. Thank you for asking.
Great, great. You ready for the Christmas break?
Absolutely.
Well, as you know, we've been working together this semester and done a couple observations of one another. I observed you and collected some data. And today is the day where I share that data with you. I know it was before Thanksgiving that I observed you,
Yes.
and then we went on break for a week. And it's always crazy ending up a semester, so we've had to delay meeting for a week. But if you think back to that lesson, I observed your fourth period. You gave instruction on tides. How do you think it went?
Well, if I recall, I believe I had a lot of things on the agenda for that day. The kids were going to be taking a test soon, so there was a lot of graded work that I needed to pass back. And I believe it was on a Wednesday, so I normally do a Weird Science Wednesday, so we watched a little video clip. And I passed back the papers, did my lesson, and then they still needed to finish an assignment that they had been working on. So I tried to pack a lot in that day. Um, so it was pretty hectic. I felt, like I had to rush through a couple of things just so that way everything could get done. I guess I felt like I could have used a little bit more time within the lecture, but just unfortunately, you know how the nature of the game goes. Sometimes we just have to plow through.
Right. Understandable. I'd written down here that Wednesday is a short
And it's
schedule
a short
anyway.
day, yeah,
We get
absolutely.
out 30 minutes early for PLC. And then you had your Weird Science Wednesday. You had some housekeeping items to take care of. You had a test that was coming up, so you wanted to hand back the graded work. You still delivered a lesson on tides, and the kids finished up their cooperative group lesson from the previous day. So
Yeah, it was a
bravo,
lot.
you got a lot done
It
in
was
a
a lot.
period. And there's no such thing as a perfect lesson, and I realize that. That's not what we're looking at. When we talked last, we had decided that we were going to look at two areas for me to collect data in. One was the use of different learning styles throughout your lesson delivery, and the other was your questioning. So I've collected data on that, and my job is to display the data to you in the form of graphs. And together we're going to work and we're going to analyze that data. What does it tell? Our strengths, our weaknesses, areas for improvement. And of course, anything that I give you is yours to keep. You can take notes on it or do what you want. But first of all, I want to compliment you on a nice lesson. I love the way you incorporated your Weird Science Wednesday. I think it brings a little bit of real life to the science. And that's nice to see because a lot of times teachers just teach the content and they don't relate it to real life and why we only see one side of the moon and why we have high
It was the
tides
title
or low
locking.
tides. Yeah. So it's just nice and refreshing to see that because a lot of times you see teachers plowing through curriculum and not taking the time to relate it to kids' daily lives. And being on the coast of Corpus Christi, we see high tides and low tides, and so for you to create those links is very meaningful to the kids, and it's great to see. Um, as always, your classroom management was superb. Your kids were really well behaved. In fact, there was one area where we had talked about me collecting data on um, student, I guess, not participation, but basically behavior during the lesson. And I couldn't really take any data on that because none of your kids were misbehaving throughout the lesson. They were all engaged throughout. You had a couple kids put their head down once in a while, but for the most part, your kids were attentive. And so I really couldn't collect data on that, which is a nice thing to see. So the first thing I'd like to go over is your use of the different learning styles. As you know, there are 3 different types of learning styles. You've got your visual, your auditory, and your kinesthetic. Do you remember what I told you with my pre-observation? What was my observation of your use of learning styles?
That I was very um, like audible, that I spoke a lot, didn't have very many of the other two.
Right. Well, you're going to see that you actually, auditory was your lowest, not your lowest, but not your highest area either. You had 14 examples in your lesson that I classified as either kinesthetic, auditory, and visual, and 7 of those were visual. After you had observed me, you had noticed that I used the smartboard a lot and I referred to it a lot. So I think you really took that to heart, and I mean, half of your lesson was visual, and that's going to capture more kids. And then, of course, with every visual, you gave an audible explanation. So you had 6 auditory and then 1 kinesthetic. And what I did is I went ahead and broke them down on this chart for you. All the different visual things that you use, pictures, and even your Weird Science Wednesday clip is a visual. You had the moon drawn on the board to show the percentage of light. Again, your Weird Science Wednesdays, your pictures of the relative location of the moon and high and low tides that you've labeled on the smartboard. Your drawing of Earth's rotation and showing the 6 hours between a high tide and a low tide. Your pictures of spring tide, your calculation that you did on the board of tidal range, and again of neap tide. I did make a note down here at the bottom. You started to run out of time because I knew you had to finish that cooperative learning activity. So there was a little reference to the neap tide picture. But overall, great. And of course, every area you had a visual, you also audibly explained it. And then your 1 kinesthetic was your highlighting notes. That is a kinesthetic activity. A couple bullets here to maybe beef up the kinesthetic because it is still a little low on our graph. Could you have students come up to the smartboard and drag the high and low tides to where they are located? I know you're packed for time or crunched for time. But in a more relaxed class, maybe you can incorporate a little more of that. Or if you're talking about, neap tide, having them do a right angle or straight tide, straight, just getting a little bit of physical movement. But overall, the positives that I take from that is that you've increased your use of visual from our pre-observation to the second observation. And then you also give multiple examples of what you're teaching to the kids. It's not just let's hear it one way and then let's move on. You continue to give them ample amount of examples. And again, the only negative that I really had was the kinesthetic was low.
Yeah.
That's the hardest one to accomplish.
Yeah.
So any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I really try to beef up the visual a little bit, and but yeah, the kinesthetics, like with tides, I normally do have kids come up to the smartboard and label where the high tides and low tides were. Just unfortunately, I have to choose something to, not do it when I'm packed for time.
Right.
But I still need to keep that in mind. Instead of having so many visuals, maybe I can do a visual, audio, and then we choose, one thing kinesthetically that they can do, so to even it out a little bit more.
I'm going to give you some strategies today also later in our conversation about how to incorporate that where they're still at their desk, but they're doing something kinesthetic, and it goes along with your questioning. So if you find it useful, by all means, we can incorporate that into your lesson. Before we met, I sent you a list of the questions, and I asked for you to classify them using Bloom's taxonomy as either a high, medium, or low question. And there were a total of 77 questions is what I had calculated. And you classified your questioning at 63% low, 33% medium, and 4% high. So I also did the same kind of classification, and I want to share with you what I came up with and we can compare. So I went through and did the same thing. I rated you a 1 for low, a 2 for medium, and a 3 for high. So to give you more of a visual look at the graph, this is how I broke it down. So your yellow area would be your low questioning, your blue would be your medium level questioning, and your green would be your high. What does this information tell you?
Well, it tells me my levels of questioning that I basically do a lot of just recall And I think mainly why I've gotten into the habit of that is just I just want to make sure they're hearing me, first and foremost. Um, this has been and maybe it's my own fault because I've had to deal with a lot of the low kids recently, my past years of teaching. So it's been a struggle just to get them to remember what I said 2 minutes ago.
Right.
So, so a lot of my questioning then have formed into those lower levels. Let me just see what you remember, if you remember what I said 2 seconds ago when you had your head down, so it's a lot of recall and getting out to having all of those kind of low kids in my classes to now having honors, or, to now all the honors kids. I've kind of struggled with that transition to, poke at them a little bit more and let's get that higher level thinking, just because for, my first 4 years of teaching, it's been, do you remember what I said a minute ago?
Right.
So I think maybe that's why I just do a lot of like the recall and naming of, questioning.
And that's understandable, especially when you're introducing a topic, because it seemed like it was more of an introductory. Your proportion of low-level questioning is going to be a little higher. So this is where you're at.
Okay.
Let's talk about where you want to be. So how would this graph look in your mind, being, the ideal situation, the ideal teacher?
Well, I would want them to be evened out a little bit because I don't want to just inundate with a bunch of high-level questioning, because I got to see where they're at first and then lead up to those higher-level questioning. But I guess, maybe that's what I need a little bit more work on is how much high-level can I ask in an introductory lesson?
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So yes, this was their first introduction into tides, so that's what like you said it. I hadn't thought about that, but it was an introductory lesson. So maybe that's why my questions were a bunch of recall. But I want to be able to get to the point to where I can have this chart a little bit more evened out.
Well, let's take a second real quick and go back in your lesson. You started out talking about moon phases, and you displayed the percentage of the moon that was lit, and it was moving towards the first quarter. And you were asking kids, this was last period, what do you think it is now? You were asking them to predict. What do you think it will be at 11 o'clock at night or 7 o'clock at night? Those are all higher level things. I assume that you've already taught moon phases. So these are the higher level questions that you're asking, which we did take note of in here. So you felt confident in your students' knowledge to be able to ask those.
Right.
Now you posed a question. I'm not sure if it was rhetorical or not, but you said, I don't know how much higher level questions or how many higher level questions to ask in an introductory lesson. My idea or my thought is you push it, and if they don't get there, your job is to help them get there eventually. So don't back off just because it is an introductory lesson. Of course, you're going to ask your baseline. Everybody understands that the moon is pulling on the Earth's ocean, and that's why we have a high tide. And then take it to the next level. And one way you can do that is dividing up your lesson into sections, main topics. So if I had to go through your main topics in your lesson, it was the cause of tides, spring tides, and neap tides. And so then outline a couple questions, how are the moon, sun, and earth lined up during a spring tide? The answer is in a straight line.
Right.
That's a lower level question. Okay, well, what moon phases are those? And a lot of times as teachers, we tend to wing those questions.
Yeah.
So when you're trying to improve in that area, a little pre-planning, a little pre-preparation, writing out those questions would help. But as far as what I'm taking this, first of all, I feel like you were a little hard on yourself. You rated yourself 63% low-level questioning. Mine's less than 50. It was about 43%. And that's just a difference of opinion. Just don't be too hard on yourself. I think your medium-level questioning is right on target. We just need to make a little less yellow and a little more blue.
Okay.
So again, if you look at this in halves, 1 being the lowest level, over half of your questioning is above low level questioning, 57%. So we're still on this is still a positive thing. We just want to just evenly distribute them. Another thing that we had talked about is wait time. And you were unfamiliar with the term.
Right.
Was I able to clarify what's your understanding of wait time?
Definitely able to clarify. So it's asking a question and giving the students enough time to process and then calling on a student, not just ask a question and then immediately call on a student to where they're taken off guard. So it's basically, we pose a question, think about it. All right, now tell me what the answer is.
Right.
And that is just, it's hard for me because I'm so used to, and a lot of the times I've got kids that shout out the answer, without not even giving the other students a chance to. So I've tried to tell my kids, I'm going to ask a question, but don't answer it because you're not helping everybody else out. But because they're just some kids are more eager or they want to show off how much they know.
Absolutely.
They, just blurt out answers. So I think that's where I've say a question and then I immediately go to a student without having them really process it. And it's just, I've recognized it, but it's a hard habit to break.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you're not only breaking your own habit, you're breaking the habit of the students that have been ingrained in them by all the teachers in the previous, not just that school year, but, teachers across all grade levels do that. Their 6th and 7th grade teachers did that. Their 4th and 5th grade. So one strategy that I do use, because I tend to struggle with that as well. I like to ask questions and the kids answer and let's keep it moving. But when it comes down to a question that I want to know specifically if these students, like it's one of the key questions, and I want everybody to be on their toes, I say, all right, before I even ask the question, raise your hand to answer this question. And just that reminder, and sometimes they still yell it out. But, that's when you snap at them. But I really try to make a point and go, okay, this is like a key main point. Asking what moon phase is this? And what, those are just kind of let's drill and kill type questions. And it's okay. It's the way the lesson is being developed. But on those, I would just kind of stop them.
Okay.
So you do pose a lot of questions to the class. As I mentioned earlier, you asked 77 questions.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's not even a full lesson. Okay.
Most of your questions are posed to the whole class.
Right.
And because you're not sitting there and calling on students and students aren't raising their hand, you don't have any wait time. So what I've done here in my chart is I've listed every question you had, and then I gave you 1 second wait time for each of them. You did, however, have a question here where you did stop and you waited 4 seconds to call on somebody. Now, the ones that don't have a wait time here, this is questions that you ask when the students were at their lab station.
Oh, okay.
So that was a little bit more difficult for me to determine because I couldn't hear the students answering on our playback video. So your average wait time here is 1 second.
Okay.
So, it's not that every single question, because it would take forever to ask 77 questions in a lesson. However, identify your key points and then try to add that weight to it. So just an area to work on. And then the last bit of information that we collected was your distribution of your questions. What I mean by distribution is how many students received a question and how many students did not. Predictions?
Well, if most of my questions were to the class, the distribution is probably not as even as it should. It's probably very one-sided.
Right, and sometimes as a teacher, you think you're reaching all your students, and it just takes a little bit of visuals and somebody coming in and doing what we've done together for you to go, oh, okay, this is an area I need to work on. It's been done to me as well by a former principal of mine. So again, you got your list of questions, and then when you see whole class, that was just one that was the answers were blurted out. and then you've got individual students that you did call on. Either they were raising their hand or you had said their name before you asked the question. Like for instance here, Hope, tell me what the cause of tides is. So before I show you the graph that goes along with this, let's talk.
Sorry.
You want to let it rain or you want to get it?
We can let it rain.
Okay. Let's talk about the pluses and minuses or the positive and negatives of posing a question like this. Hope, tell me what causes our tides.
Well, I already know because, and one of the things that we're taught as teachers, or that we try is ask a question and then call on somebody. You never want to single somebody out and then ask the question because it loses the class.
Right.
When somebody else, the rest of the class is like, oh well, she didn't call me to answer that question, so boom, they checked out.
Right.
So I do catch myself doing that, but normally when I call on somebody specifically, it's because I know they weren't paying attention. So it could have been something like I just said, what was the question that let's say I just said what the cause of tides was, and I know that person was looking in her binder or she was, twiddling with something. So I will specifically call on that student because I know that they weren't paying attention right when I said it.
So it's a management strategy.
I use that as a management strategy sometimes.
She's in RTI.
Okay. Because,
Okay.
So, but I know that sometimes I do, we'll just call on a student like that. So the negative to that is you'll tend to lose a class or some students when you call on them first.
And you didn't do it much. So let's see. I did make a note here that the level of success of your questions, whether the students were getting the answers right or wrong, it's unable to be determined since the majority of your questions are presented to the entire group of students. When you do use this method, all but 6 of your questions were answered correctly within the first. So someone in your class knows the answer. But incorrect responses, I did note here next to the who they were addressed to, whether they got it wrong. But it's usually the most intellectual or the brighter students that are answering. So you're not always getting a gauge as to whether or not they're understanding. So if you look at your 77 questions, 77 being 100% of your questions, a little less than 80% were posed to the whole class, and then a little more than 20% were posed to individual students. So just to kind of keep your students alert during the lesson and on their toes, we'd like to maybe see this number skew a little more towards the 50-50 mark, if not further over. Then the last little bit of information that I wanted to share with you is your student involvement. I should go and show you this. These are the bars of the students who received questions. For example, Madi got 2 questions, Chandler got 1 question, and here's the whole class is 61. So you do have students that during the period were not addressed in there. And so what that looks like on a graph is 44% of your students received questions, but 56% were not involved in the lesson. You might take these as negatives.
No, it's definitely something that I hadn't thought about before. I guess posing a question to the whole class versus, asking specific students those questions. Because I guess maybe that's where I'm feeling that I'm not connecting, because I do ask questions to the class, but I didn't realize, I guess the effect of that, of asking whole questions versus just individual student questioning. Because honestly, I really didn't think to to tailor my questions to specific students when I ask when I'm giving a lesson. I guess, I mean, could you kind of see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying. I see where you're going.
Like, okay, so when I do give a lesson and I'm asking the class, I guess because I ask the whole question, the class the question, whoever raises their hand, but I can see to where it's that one student that's always gonna answer my question. But then the reverse of that is, let's say that class, for instance, is not a for AP class. So I really struggle with getting students to just kind of talk, or not really struggle, but they're just a quiet class.
Right.
So if I ask a student specifically, I ask a question and then I call out a student, then I guess I see that as being more time consuming. Mm-hmm. So that's why I tend to structure my lessons addressing the whole class.
And it's very easy to do. We have such a tight curriculum, and everything has to be covered before the STAR test. And, I'm in the same boat as you are. Mm-hmm. We have to get everything done, and if we don't, it spills over tomorrow, and then that gets us late, and then we might not get everything covered before the STAR test, or at least before the 6 weeks test, or whatever. And so you get into that mode of, kind of rushing through.
Right. But no, this is definitely eye-opening because, number one, answers, some of my own internal questions, like, how can I do this more? But I guess, because, now that it's been shown to me, I'm seeing that. I'm like, oh my God, I do need to do that. I ask whole class questions rather than just making sure all of my students are getting, some sort of, or I'm getting feedback from one of them in class.
Right, and this is a learning process. Teaching, life, I consider it to be a lifelong learner, and the minute we stop learning is the minute we stop growing. And so to grow in the profession is to learn and to improve. And so this is just the start. I sat and observed, and you were concerned about your classroom management, and you got that down pat. You know your content. So now it's taking all of that you've worked so hard to establish, understanding what you're teaching, controlling the class, and now taking it to the next level. Because you're a 5-year teacher, and you should have a control of those things like you do. Mm-hmm. So now that's when you really, the 5 to 10 year, you grow in that area of improving as far as in your delivery.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah. I hadn't looked at that in that aspect.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about a plan of action as we finish up our conversation. My assignment is done for my semester. My practicum course is done. However, I would like to continue to work with you in this area.
Absolutely.
Now that you've been made a little more aware of your patterns and your habits, maybe that's an area in, maybe once 6 weeks next semester, I could observe you and we could see the trends and then go back and compare to this is our base.
Yeah.
And then how have we improved throughout the semester. Again, it's optional. You've helped me fulfill my requirements for this assignment for grad school, but if this is something that you're interested in doing, I don't mind taking the time and working with you on that. I do have a couple of suggestions or ideas. Have you ever seen these before?
Yes, but I've never used them.
Okay, so you cut them out and it folds into a cube.
Right.
But before you do so, you would write down like true, false, A, B, C, D, or yes, no, or whatever kind of answers you want. Go make copies, and then maybe you can get some classroom helpers or paras or somebody to help you create them. And then every single kid gets one of these on their desk, and you ask a question, and they all hold up, and it's immediate understanding from every single student in the room. If you said, tides are caused by Jupiter's gravity, true or false?
Right.
You should have, true in blue and false in red, and that way you see red across the board, and when you see a blue, that kid didn't get it. Okay, or they're being silly.
Right.
So I would definitely use some color coding on these as well. Neat during a neat tide, the sun, earth, and moon are aligned in a straight line, or B, a right angle. So everybody should be
Right.
holding up B or whatever.
Mhm.
And you just kind of use these as a tool to keep the kids kinesthetically involved,
Yeah.
keep them alert, on their toes, ready to answer a question, and then giving you immediate feedback. Do you have to use something as fancy as this? No. In the past, I've used cards that have yes and no on them.
Mhm.
All period, I'm asking yes or no questions, and I should
Right.
have my yeses were blue and my no's were red, and I didn't, I should have just seen a sea of the same color.
Right.
Fingers as well. 2 fingers for true, 3 fingers for false. Be careful for one finger. You might get the wrong finger. And again, that's a kinesthetic thing when they're more involved. So just some ideas for you to maybe try and incorporate, and a little bit at a time. You don't want to,
Right.
attack the whole thing at once. Work on including every kid and then maybe adding that later. I'm going to email you some websites on research that's been done in questioning, but I did print off some things that might help you get started. When you're planning out your questions, these are your different levels of blooms. So if you want to pose, a low-level question, you would look in these columns here, which one or whatever, and then your higher-level questions are here on the back. Just to kind of, help you with your planning or your pre-planning question. And then I found this handout to be very useful on how to plan for effective questioning. So as you are thinking about your upcoming lesson, some steps that you can take, and then the actual technique that you would use throughout the lesson that gives students time to think. There's that wait time again. So use these at your leisure. You can look over them, and it's been a pleasure to work with you this semester, and I appreciate you volunteering to help me out as I'm continuing to learn and grow. And I'm excited that you want to keep going throughout the semester. Is there anything, final thoughts or questions that you might have?
No, I mean, other than this is extremely useful in, what I felt I've been struggling with, and because I don't see it, I'm in it, so I don't see the whole picture, like as if my whole lesson, how I'm doing it, because it's kind of like you can't tell what's happening because you're deep inside the hole. So, so yeah, this has been definitely, very eye-opening, and what can maybe alleviate some of the frustrations that I have in class is because I've been doing it, I've been making it harder on myself rather than making it easier for myself and for the kids to learn. So
I hope you
very, very useful.
Thank you. Enjoy the information and use some of the suggestions.
I definitely will. Thank you very much.
Well, we will be in contact later, and have a great holidays.
Thanks.